Throughout history, people with dwarfism have been treated differently by various cultures in different time periods. Ancient Egyptians saw dwarves as a celestial gift, residing comfortably within the upper class and even being buried alongside the kings they served. By the time Rome came along, the status of the dwarf had been greatly diminished. Here, they would often serve as slaves, although a portion of them were fortunate enough to retain their position among the Roman aristocracy. Ancient Chinese history is where we find one of the first descriptions of actual court dwarves, with a definitive place in the royal family. It seems as though this wasn't a terrible position for the dwarfs to be in, as much of the nobility would take a liking to them. One Chinese historian from the Han Dynasty recounts a story about a court dwarf named Yu Zan. Yu saw some guards standing outside in the rain, and convinced the emperor to change out their posts so that they would be able to have a break inside the building. A similar story involves another emperor of the Han Dynasty purchasing a large quantity of dwarves for the purpose of having them serve as jesters and slaves. But a providential governor insisted that they be treated as servants instead of slaves. This prompted the emperor to release the dwarves, who then proceeded to worship the providential governor who freed them. But this kind of reciprocal relationship with the dwarves was not always the status quo. Confucius, the philosopher whose religion is still practiced by 6.1 million people, is alleged to have killed several of his court dwarves whenever he would triumph over one in a heated debate. Ancient biographers of Confucius only brought forth this claim after he had been dead for a while, but assuming it's true, then it makes what comes next seem a little more believable. Arguably the worst part of court dwarf history comes from a source by Martin Monastier. Monastier went into detail on how Tang Dynasty Emperor Zhuangzang built a so-called resting place for desirable monsters, in which the purported monsters would be sexually abused. Dwarves were mentioned as being among the victims of this palace. The court dwarves of medieval Europe, however, didn't have such a bad hand dealt to them, aside from having dwarfism, and all the complications that leads to, of course. In a similar vein to Pokemon cards, the royalty and aristocracy would challenge each other to see who could collect the most court dwarves, and they were often treated as being a friendly gift that could be exchanged as a warm welcome. A particularly wealthy Russian noblewoman, Natalia Alexeyevna, one of the relatives of Peter the Great, owned an astonishing 93 court dwarves. Now, this all does sound a bit objectifying, but consider the fact that, depending on who you ask, peasants knew nothing but back-breaking work for the vast majority of their short lives. Wouldn't it really be that bad to be treated like a commodity if the alternative was always facing starvation, being ridden with disease, and living amongst piles of human waste? But keep in mind, it wasn't all fun and games for these dwarves. They, unlike jesters, resided in courts permanently and had actual duties which they needed to fulfill. They'd typically be standing close to the reigning monarch, giving him the appearance of being tall. Naturally, these dwarves were among the people who had direct access to the king, giving them the potential to have vast influence over political affairs, although stories about influential dwarves are infrequent. They did, however, frequently serve as diplomats to regional powers. When the favorite court dwarf of Peter the Great died, the Tsar conducted an elaborate dwarf-themed state funeral for him. He spared no expense, even procuring multiple miniature horses and a, quote, small priest. This brings us to an eccentric individual by the name of Jeffrey Hudson. Now, the story of this guy is almost too whimsical to be taken at face value, but believe me, everything about this guy is purportedly true. The greatest of the court dwarves, in my opinion, was Sir Jeffrey Hudson. Born in 1619, Jeffrey Hudson was an unusual dwarf due to the proportional accuracy of his body. He was able to achieve a surprising degree of social mobility for the time, effectively entering the nobility when he burst out from Queen Henrietta Maria's pie, entirely clad in a miniature set of armor. Like the majority of court dwarves, he was offered as a gift to the queen and became her possession. It is here that Hudson moved into the famous Somerset house, and lived among the various other oddities they had collected, including 2 other dwarves, a giant, and a monkey called Pug, which seems to be a bit of a misnomer, but what do I know? Hudson's life would prove to be full of adventure. He was captured by pirates in 1630, became a captain during the English Civil War in 1640, and began to take himself more seriously. He declined the opportunity to again become a source of amusement to the aristocracy, assuring to the world that he would no longer be a subject of ridicule. By the time 1644 came, Hudson challenged the brother of a baron to a duel. His opponent did not take his offer as seriously as Hudson had, as he showed up to the duel with nothing but a squirt gun. I didn't even know those existed in the 17th century. So this guy comes up to Hudson and is blasting him with this ineffectual water gun. So can you guess what Hudson does? He nails him in the forehead and the guy drops dead on the spot. Now, by this point in time, Dueling was seen as something that was barbaric and illegal, and the added fact that Hudson kind of murdered him meant that he would have hell to pay with the Baron. He was originally going to be executed, but his connection with Henrietta Maria saved him from the death sentence. Jeffrey Hudson's life afterwards was much less glamorous. In the fallout from the calamity with the Baron's brother, Hudson found himself at a place that no 1600s Englishman ever wanted to be: the Barbary Coast. And being in the Barbary Coast, he was captured by the Barbary pirates, who then proceeded to enslave him and have him perform hard labor over the course of 25 years. In the year 1669, he was rescued by the English and returned to his homeland. Hudson's final years were not extremely majestic either. At the time he returned to England, there was a massive anti-Catholic sentiment spreading throughout the kingdom, and his status as a Roman Catholic led to his imprisonment for a, quote, considerable time. He was released in 1680 and was found dead after 2 years passed. Hudson was buried in an unmarked grave. Well, there you have it. That's what it was like to be a court dwarf. Part of me wishes that we still had guys like these.